For 11 days, Earth said nothing. No transmissions, no diplomatic signals, no civilian broadcasts. No noise at all from a planet that had never once been quiet in the entire 30 years I had spent studying it. My name is Vithara, and I am an intelligence analyst for the Galactic Council. Their arguments and their laughter. Humans are not a quiet species. Humans are never quiet. So when the silence came, I did not sleep for 3 days. It started on a Tuesday. That is what the humans call the third day of their week. A small fact I had always found oddly charming. One moment their signals were streaming across every frequency we monitored, and the next moment they were gone. All of them. At exactly the same second. My supervisor, a senior analyst named Prethan, told me it was a technical failure. A cascading relay collapse, he said. Happens sometimes. I asked him if he had ever seen a cascading relay collapse that took down every frequency simultaneously, including the ones that had no shared infrastructure. He did not answer me. We sent 3 probe vessels toward Earth's outer system within the first 6 hours. The probes returned clean data. Earth was not destroyed. The cities were lit. The agriculture networks were running. The orbital stations were visible, docked and still. The planet was alive and moving. It simply was not talking. I filed my first report on day 2. I wrote that something coordinated was happening. I wrote that in my professional experience, the only time a species goes completely silent all at once is when they are preparing something that they do not want observed. My report was reviewed, noted, and filed. No action was taken. On day 3, I started building a model. I pulled every piece of human behavioral data I had access to, going back 40 years. How they organized under pressure. How they communicated when they felt threatened. What I found did not comfort me. Humans have a word for what they were doing. It is called discipline. And discipline in humans is not natural. It is trained. It is chosen. It is maintained at great personal cost by individuals who understand that the discomfort of one serves the safety of many. A species that could go completely silent, with no warning, across an entire planet, had been practicing that kind of discipline for a very long time. On day 4, the council convened a session to discuss Earth. I was not invited to speak. I listened from a gallery seat as 3 senior members debated whether humanity had collapsed internally, been conquered by an unknown force, or suffered some kind of collective psychological event. One member suggested that the humans had simply decided to stop engaging with the galaxy because they were embarrassed about a trade dispute the previous year. On day 5, I began pulling records I had never needed before. Shipyard registrations, transit manifests, construction permits filed with the Council's Trade Bureau. Humans were required to register all vessel construction above a certain tonnage. I had always assumed they complied, the way most species complied. data we had collected passively from human industrial zones over the past 30 years. The numbers did not match, not by a small margin, by an enormous one. I spent day 6 running the calculation 4 more times, certain I had made an error. I had not. The energy output from human shipyards, factored against known fuel costs and construction times, suggested a fleet many times larger than anything registered with the Council. Then I filed another report. This one I marked urgent. On day 7, I received a message from a senior council official telling me that my energy consumption analysis was based on flawed assumptions and that I should return to my primary duties. I read that message 3 times. Then I kept working. Day 8 was when the other species started to notice. Who maintained the largest registered military fleet in the known galaxy, sent a quiet inquiry to the Council, asking whether Earth's silence had been officially explained. The Sithani Trade Consortium halted 2 cargo runs that passed near human space and requested route clearance confirmation before continuing. A border colony operated by the Delhari people filed a formal observation report, had completely ceased with no prior notice. Everyone was watching now. Everyone was being very careful not to say that they were watching. On day 9, I contacted an old colleague, an analyst named Corvin, who worked in deep space survey, and asked him to quietly point his long-range gravimetric sensors toward the outer edges of human territory. It was a favor between people who had worked together for years and trusted each other. He called me back within 6 hours, and his voice, when he spoke, was very controlled. He had found mass concentrations, thousands of objects, holding position just beyond the asteroid belts of several star systems simultaneously. They were not moving. They were waiting. I asked him how long they had been there. He said his equipment could not determine that with certainty, but based on their positioning and the absence of any transit signature, they had arrived slowly and quietly over a period of weeks, possibly months, moving in very small groups at very low power, the way you move when you do not want to be seen arriving. I thanked him. I filed a third report. This one I addressed directly to the Council's security chair. I received no response. I went back through my personal records and found a conversation I had logged 3 years earlier. I had been at a diplomatic reception and had spoken briefly with a human trade envoy named Carter. He was a calm, pleasant man with gray at his temples and very patient eyes. We had talked about human expansion policy, and I had asked him, as a casual question, whether humanity ever worried about being outnumbered in a galaxy full of older, more established civilizations. He had smiled and said that humans had a saying. He said they called it hoping for peace while preparing for something else. I had written it down because I found it interesting. I had not understood, at the time, that it was not a saying. It was a policy statement. On day 11, every human orbital station went dark. Not destroyed, not abandoned. Powered down. Every relay, every beacon, every docked vessel in registered orbit, all of it, at once, went to zero emission. The planet below them was still lit, still alive, but now even the lights they had left on in space were turned off. I sat in my office and looked at the display showing Earth's system, every sensor reading flatlined or absent, and I understood something that made my chest feel very heavy. The silence was not a sign that something was about to happen. The silence was the message itself. Humanity was showing the galaxy what it looked like when they chose to disappear. They were showing us that they could. I wrote 4 words at the bottom of my latest report, and sent it to every address I had access to, including 3 I was not technically authorized to use. The words were, "They chose this. Listen." Then I went home, sat in the dark, and waited for day 12. Day 12 began the way the 11 before it had. Silent. Still. The sensors across every monitoring station showed Earth as a quiet, living world surrounded by nothing. No traffic, no signals. No movement. I had not slept more than a few hours since the silence began. My eyes hurt, and my thoughts were moving in that slightly fractured way they do when a person has been under pressure for too long. seemed to understand that we were not watching a crisis. We were watching a demonstration. The gravimetric readings changed. Corvin sent me a message with no words in it, just a data packet. I opened it and stared at the numbers for a full minute before I could speak. The mass concentrations he had found the day before were moving. Not outward. Not toward council space. They were moving inward. Toward Earth. Every cluster, in every system where he had detected them, was converging on the same point. I ran the projection. If they maintained their current velocity, they would reach Earth orbit in approximately 14 hours. I filed an emergency report. This time, someone responded within 20 minutes. The Council's chief security advisor, a senior official named Cale Thevris, sent me a single line asking if I was certain of my readings. I replied that I was. He told me to come to the secure briefing chamber immediately. I had never been inside that room before. It was smaller than I expected, and the people sitting around the table looked exactly the way I felt, like they had not slept and were trying very hard not to show it. I presented my data. I walked them through the energy consumption analysis, the gravimetric positioning data, and the timeline I had built over the past 11 days. I spoke for 40 minutes without interruption, which had never happened to me in a professional setting before. When I finished, the room was quiet. Cale Thevris asked me how large the fleet was. I told him I did not know the exact number. I told him my conservative estimate, based on the mass readings and standard human vessel displacement figures, was somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 ships. The silence that followed that statement lasted a long time. The Varathi representative in the room, a military liaison named Drevith, stood up slowly. He was a large being, heavily built, with a long record in their defense forces. He said that the Varathi hegemony maintained 82,000 warships. He said that was the largest registered military fleet in the galaxy. He said that the number I had just presented was not possible. What followed was 4 hours of the most intense discussion I had ever witnessed. Faction after faction argued for different responses. The Vorathi wanted to treat the converging fleet as a hostile force and prepare a defensive posture. 3 smaller species argued that this was an internal human matter, and that the Council should not interfere. A diplomatic faction suggested sending an immediate message to Earth asking for clarification before drawing any conclusions. I argued against all military posturing, not because I was certain humanity was peaceful, but because I had spent 30 years studying them, and I knew something the military faction did not seem to understand. Humans do not position a force of that size and then fire first. It is not how they operate. Humans, when they are angry, want to be heard before they act. The fleet was not an attack. The fleet was a raised hand. Nobody asked me to continue speaking after I said that. While the Council debated, I kept working. I pulled the human shipyard data again and started mapping construction sites against the timeline of the past 4 decades. What I found was not a hidden weapons program. It was something far more patient and far more deliberate. The construction had begun in small numbers about 40 years ago. A few vessels here and there, well within registered limits. Then, very gradually, over many years, the output had increased. But the increase happened in places that were not being watched closely. Moons with no Council monitoring stations. Asteroid belt installations too small to warrant registration. Deep rock facilities on colony worlds that were classified as agricultural settlements. The humans had not hidden their construction behind some dramatic secret program. They had simply built in the places no one was looking, and no one had ever thought to check. I thought about Carter and his patient eyes. I thought about how many conversations I had logged with human diplomats over the years where they had been polite, cooperative, and slightly deferential. Not because they were weak, because they were waiting. The thought settled into me like cold water. At hour 9 of day 12, Corvin sent me another message. This one had words. He wrote, "They are forming up above Earth now. All of them. It is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen on a sensor display." He did. I looked at it for a long time. The space above Earth was filling. Not chaotically. Not in a rush. The vessels were arriving in ordered groups, taking positions in a structure that was clearly pre-planned, slotting into a formation so large it was difficult to understand at first because the human eye, even a trained analyst's eye, is not built to process that kind of scale quickly. The ships were not identical. Some were large, some were small. Some were clearly military in design. Many were not. There were cargo haulers that had been fitted with additional systems. There were colony transports that had been reconfigured. There were vessels of types I had never seen registered anywhere, built from designs that had never been shared with the Council's Trade Bureau. All of them were rising. All of them were positioning, and none of them had a single weapon system in an active state. I had been an intelligence analyst for 30 years. I had studied conflict, preparation for conflict, and the moments just before conflict for my entire career. What I was looking at was not conflict. It was the most controlled, most deliberate, most precisely organized thing I had ever seen a species do. At hour 11 of day 12, Drevith came to find me in the side room where I had been working and asked me, quietly, with his military composure just barely intact, whether I had any idea what humanity wanted. I told him I had a very good idea. I told him that humanity had filed 6 formal grievances with the Council in the past 12 years. I told him that every one of those grievances had been acknowledged, reviewed, and quietly set aside without resolution. I told him that 3 of those grievances involved serious harm to human colonies, including a Vorathi military action against a human convoy that had been classified as an accident and closed without accountability. He said that matter had been settled. I asked him who had settled it. He did not answer. The formation above Earth was nearly complete. 500,000 ships, assembled in the dark, waiting. The most patient, most calculated response to 30 years of being ignored that I had ever encountered. And then, at hour 14, the lights came back on. Every human station, every relay, every beacon in the system powered up simultaneously. And from Earth itself, for the first time in 12 days, a signal went out. Not a weapon, not a warning shot, a broadcast. In every registered galactic language, spoken clearly and without anger, a recorded voice began to speak. A woman's voice, steady, unhurried. The voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time and was no longer in any rush at all, because the waiting was over. My hands were very still as I listened. The rest of the room had gone completely silent, and in that silence, halfway across the galaxy, 500,000 human ships held their position and waited for the Council to understand what they were looking at. I had listened to thousands of recorded speeches in my career. Diplomatic addresses, military declarations, formal protests delivered through the proper channels by representatives who had been trained to soften every sharp edge and wrap every grievance in the careful language of procedure. I had always found those speeches slightly hollow, the words correct but the feeling distant, as if the person speaking had already accepted that nothing would truly change. The voice from Earth was not like that. as she introduced herself, was Director Laura Okafor. She spoke in Council Standard first, then cycled through 17 other registered languages without pausing between them, her pronunciation precise in each one, which told me the speech had been prepared and rehearsed long before this moment. She was not improvising. This had been planned. She began with a sentence that stopped every conversation in the briefing chamber. She said, "We did not come here today to threaten you." She let that sit for 3 full seconds before continuing. And then she said, "We came here because you have made it very clear, over many years, that anything less than this would continue to be ignored." The room around me was completely still. I did not move. She named 3 events. She named them in full detail, with dates, with the names of the council members who had received the formal complaints, with the case reference numbers that had been assigned to each grievance and then never acted upon. She was not reading from memory. She was reading from records. Human records, kept carefully, over years, by people who understood that documentation is its own kind of power. The first was a council vote, taken 9 years ago, that had stripped human deep space colonies of mineral extraction rights, in a sector that those colonies had developed and operated for 2 decades. The vote had reclassified the sector as a shared galactic resource zone, which sounded neutral until you understood that it meant the human colonies lost their primary economic foundation overnight and received no compensation. 3 formal protests had been filed. All 3 had been acknowledged and set aside. The second was a Vorathi military action that had taken place 6 years ago. A human cargo convoy, 12 ships carrying food and medical supplies to a border colony, had been intercepted by a Vorathi patrol vessel that claimed they were operating in restricted space. The convoy had carried full documentation showing they were not. The patrol had fired on them anyway. 4 ships had been destroyed. The crew of those 4 ships had not survived. The council investigation that followed had classified the incident as a navigation error. The Vorathi patrol commander had received a formal reprimand and continued their service career without interruption. The third was a trade sanction, applied 4 years ago against a specific human colony world following a dispute over tariff classification. The sanction had been designed to be temporary, pending a review that was never completed. "11 times it had been deferred. For 4 years, that colony had operated under economic restrictions that cut their import access by 60%. The colony's population, Director Okafor said, was mostly families. She said the word families the way someone says it when they want you to understand they are not speaking in abstractions. She did not shout. She did not use dramatic language. She stated each fact the way a person states something that they have said before, and been ignored before, and are saying one final time with no expectation that they will need to say it again. Then she stated the demand. The council would convene a full and binding tribunal within 30 days. The tribunal would have genuine authority to issue decisions and enforce outcomes. It would review all 3 matters in full. It would hear from human representatives and from the affected colony populations directly. Its findings would be binding on all council members, including founding members, including the Vorathi hegemony. If the tribunal was not convened within 30 days, or if any attempt was made to interfere with human vessels, human colonies, or human territory in the interim, humanity would consider its treaty obligations to the council suspended, and would make its own arrangements for the security of its people. That was the entire speech. No further threats. No list of what those arrangements might look like. No description of what the 500,000 ships visible on every sensor in the galaxy would actually do. She did not need to describe them. Everyone watching already knew they were there. She ended by saying, "We hope you will choose wisely. We have waited a long time for you to do so." The transmission ended. For about 10 seconds, nobody in the briefing chamber said anything at all. Then Drevith stood up and said that humanity had just issued a military ultimatum, and that the council was obligated to treat it as such. He said the Vorathi hegemony would not be subjected to the jurisdiction of a tribunal over a matter that had already been formally closed. Without standing up, without raising my voice, that Director Okafor had been very specific. She had not threatened military action. She had described a political consequence, suspended treaty obligations. Those were not the same thing. Anyone in this room who chose to respond to this as a military provocation would be the one who turned it into one. He sat back down. Cale Thevris, who had not spoken in some time, asked me what I thought humanity's actual intentions were. He asked it carefully, the way someone asks a question when they already suspect the answer and are hoping to be wrong. I told him that I had spent 30 years studying humans, and that my honest assessment was this. They did not want a war. Wars are expensive, painful, and unpredictable, and humans understand those things better than most species because they have fought more wars among themselves than any other civilization in council records. What they wanted was accountability. What they wanted was to be taken seriously. What they wanted was for the 11 requests and the 3 grievances and the 4 years of watching a colony struggle under an expired sanction to finally matter to someone with the authority to change things. The fleet above Earth, I told him, was not a weapon. It was evidence. It was proof that they had the capacity to demand what they were asking for, so that no one in this room could pretend the request was made from weakness. Cale Thevris was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you reach the human delegation?" I said I believed so. He said, "Then do it." I left the chamber and went to find a communications terminal. My hands were steady. My mind was very clear. I had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask me that question too. The neutral station where the human delegation had established their contact point was 3 relay hops from Council Central. I sent my credentials and my request through official channels and received a confirmed response within 2 hours. I suspected, been expecting someone for several days. Her name was Director Laura Okafor, the same woman whose voice had addressed the galaxy that morning. In person, she was taller than I had expected, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent many years in environments where it mattered. She greeted me by name, in my own language, with a pronunciation that was not perfect, but was considerably better than most people managed without practice. I told her the council had received the address. She said she knew. I asked her if she would be willing to speak with me candidly, not as a formal diplomatic exchange but as 2 people trying to understand each other's position. She considered that for a moment. Then she said yes. We sat across a table in a small meeting room, just the 2 of us, no recording equipment that I was aware of, though I assumed she had her own. She set a cup of something hot on the table in front of her, and held it in both hands the way humans do when they want to feel grounded. I asked her about the 11 days of silence. She said it had been a vote. Every human being on Earth, and on every human colony world had been asked, through their community networks, to observe a communications blackout for 11 days. No government mandate. No enforcement mechanism. Just a request. And a reason. I sat with that for a moment. Billions of people. 11 days. No single voice breaking. I asked her how that was possible. She looked at me with those patient eyes that reminded me of Carter from the diplomatic reception 3 years ago. And she said that humans had spent a very long time learning to trust each other because they had spent an equally long time learning what happened when they did not. She said the silence was not obedience. It was agreement. Those, she told me, are very different things. I asked about the ships. She told me the construction had started quietly, many years ago, after the first major grievance was filed with the Council, and returned without action. She said humanity had not planned for this outcome specifically. They had planned for the possibility that the Council might never take them seriously through conventional means, and they had decided that they would not allow that possibility to leave them without options. I asked her if she was aware of how frightening that was. From the perspective of every other species watching, she said she understood that it was frightening. She said she was sorry that it had come to this. She said the word sorry, the way a person says it when they mean it, but also when they know that regret does not change what was necessary. I told her the Council was divided. I told her that Drevath and the Vorathi faction were likely to push for a response that framed this as a military tone confrontation. She nodded. She did not seem surprised. She said, "Then your job, Vithara, and mine, is to make sure wiser people prevail." I asked her why she trusted me to do that. She said she had read my reports. All of them. Every one I had filed over 30 years, including the ones that had been set aside without response. She said I had been telling the Council the truth for decades and they had not been listening to me either. I did not know what to say to that. She picked up her cup and took a slow drink, and then she said, very quietly, that she hoped we would not need those ships. She said every person aboard every one of them had a family. She said they had not come all this way to fight. They had come all this way to finally be in a room where someone would have to listen. I left the station 2 hours later, and spent the entire journey back to Council Central sitting in silence, which felt appropriate. When I returned to the briefing chamber, I told Cale Thevris everything, and then I told him that my professional recommendation was simple. Convene the tribunal, honor it, and understand that the moment the Council chose to treat this as a conflict rather than a conversation, it would become one. That outcome would not benefit anyone in this room. He asked me if I believed the humans would actually follow through, if the ships were real, or a display. I told him they were real. Every single one of them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he would bring it to a full council session in the morning. I went back to my desk, sat down, and filed my most important report in 30 years. It was the first one I had written in a very long time that I believed might actually change to something. The full council session began at first light, council standard, and within the first hour it had descended into something that resembled organized chaos. I had attended many council sessions over my career, and they were rarely smooth, but this one had a quality I had never felt in that chamber before. Beneath every carefully worded statement, beneath every procedural motion and formal objection, there was something close to fear. Not fear of the human fleet. Or not only that, fear of what the human fleet represented, which was the answer to a question nobody had been willing to ask out loud for 30 years. The question of whether the Council was actually just, whether the structures that governed galactic civilization were serving everyone in them, or only the species that had been powerful long enough to shape those structures to their own benefit. Drevath and the Vorathi faction argued that the tribunal demand was unconstitutional under existing council charter, that no member species could use military force to compel a legal process, and that acceding to this demand would set a precedent that undermined the authority of the entire governance structure. I listened to that argument and wrote one line in my notes. The Vorathi are afraid of accountability. That is not the same thing as being right. 3 other factions argued variations of the same position. If humanity could do this, any species with sufficient military capacity could demand anything at any time. A representative from the Sithani Trade Consortium, a quiet and methodical analyst named Priva Sol, raised a hand and asked whether any of those speaking had read the actual text of the human grievances. The room went briefly silent. Priva Sol said they had read all three. They said the mineral rights decision had been procedurally flawed from the beginning, that the convoy incident had never met the evidentiary standard required for closure, and that the trade sanction review had been deferred 11 times in 4 years, which was, in their assessment, a failure of basic administrative function. They said this not as a political statement, but as an observation of fact. Dravath said that was not relevant to the current discussion. Priva Sol said, with the particular calm of someone who does not need to raise their voice to be heard, that they believed it was extremely relevant. They said the question before the council was not whether humanity had the right to make this demand in this way. The question was whether the demand itself was legitimate. And if the demand was legitimate, then the method of delivery, while unconventional, was the direct result of the council's own failure to respond through proper channels. The session paused twice for private consultations, and resumed both times in a worse mood than before. By midday, the divisions were clear. The Vorathi and 2 allied factions were holding firm against any tribunal. 6 other factions were either in favor, or privately signaling that they could not afford to be seen opposing it. 4 factions were waiting to see which direction felt safer before committing. I was not in the chamber. I was in a side room with access to the same feeds, watching and continuing my own work. I was doing something more useful. I was building the case. I had 30 years of archived reports, cross-referenced grievances, internal communications, council voting records, and diplomatic correspondence. I had spent my entire career watching information that mattered get filed and forgotten. Now I began pulling it all together into a single, comprehensive document. Not for the debate, for the tribunal. Because I had decided, sitting in that meeting room with Director Okafor and her cup of something hot, that the tribunal was going to happen. And when it did, the record was going to be complete. At hour 6 of the session, something changed. 3 small species that I had not expected to be significant in this debate, the Delhari, the Ovani, and a quiet collective called the Muresh, submitted a joint statement to the session. It was short. It said that they wished to formally observe that the council had received similar grievances from Delhari and Ovani representatives over the previous 15 years, and that those grievances had also been set aside without resolution. that the pattern Director Okafor had described was not unique to human experience. The effect in the chamber was immediate and different from anything the human fleet had produced. Because the fleet was one thing. It was large. It was extraordinary. It was unprecedented. But it was still one species making a demand. This was three other species saying, quietly and without any ships at all, us too. I read that statement 3 times and thought about something Director Okafor had said to me. She had said that the moment wiser people prevailed, this would be over. I wondered if she had known about the Delhari and Ovani statements. I suspected she had. Tribunal. Not a vote on the tribunal itself, just a vote on whether to talk about it. The result was 22 in favor, 9 against, and 4 abstentions. Dravath stood and said that the Varathi hegemony did not recognize the validity of any proceeding conducted under coercion and would be withdrawing from the session. He walked to the door. A message arrived simultaneously on every screen in the chamber. It was from Director Okafor. It said, simply, "We are aware that certain factions may choose to withdraw. The 500,000 ships currently positioned above Earth will remain in place until the tribunal is complete. They will not move, and they will not engage any vessel. They are simply there. We believe everyone will find that more comfortable if the tribunal proceeds." Dravath stood at the door for a long moment. Then he came back to his seat. I allowed myself, privately, a very small feeling of satisfaction. Over the next 14 days, the framework for the tribunal was built. It was painful and slow, and there were moments when I was certain it would collapse entirely. The Varathi negotiators pushed for limitations on scope, on authority, on what the tribunal's findings could actually mandate. The human delegation, represented by a quiet and precise lawyer named Director Okafor, and a small team that I came to deeply respect, held every important line without visible anger. I was asked, on day 4 of the negotiations, to present my archived report documentation to the tribunal committee. I had been preparing for that for days. I sat in front of the committee and for 2 hours I read from reports that I had filed and that had been ignored. I read the dates, the case numbers, the names of officials who had received the reports, and the responses, or absence of responses, that had followed. I read without editorializing. The documents said everything that needed to be said. several senior officials. I told him that was the point. The tribunal was formally convened on day 30, exactly as demanded. The tribunal lasted 9 days. I attended every session. On the first day, the mineral rights case was opened. The human legal team presented documentation that filled 6 hours of testimony. They showed the original development agreements. They showed the investment records from the human colonies that had built the extraction infrastructure over 20 years. They showed the council vote that had reclassified the sector, and they showed the procedural record of that vote, which revealed that 3 key members had material interests in the reclassification outcome and had not disclosed those interests before casting their votes. That last point caused the first significant disruption of the tribunal. 2 of those 3 members were still serving on the council. One of them attempted to raise a procedural objection to the relevance of the disclosure issue. The tribunal chair, an independent arbitration authority the council had been required to appoint under the terms agreed in negotiation, overruled the objection without discussion. I watched that happen and felt something I had not felt in a professional context in a very long time. I felt like justice was something that could actually exist, rather than just something that was discussed. On the 3rd day, the convoy case was heard. The human team presented the navigation documentation for the convoy, showing clearly that the ships had been operating in permitted space. They presented communication records from the convoy vessels in the final minutes before the Vorathi patrol opened fire, showing the convoy had identified itself, provided documentation, and requested acknowledgement of safe passage. Which contained a discrepancy in the timing records that the original council investigation had classified as a minor inconsistency and not pursued. A human witness was called. She was an older woman, white-haired, with a stillness about her that the room felt immediately. Her name was Constance Webb. She had been on the one convoy ship that had survived the incident because it had been at the edge of the formation and had managed to pull away. She had spent 6 years filing formal requests for a complete review of her testimony from the original investigation, requests that had been acknowledged and deferred. She testified for 4 hours. I did not take notes during Constance Webb's testimony. I just listened. At the end of it, Dravath's representative on the tribunal, who had been trying to limit the scope of the proceedings at every opportunity, asked no cross-examination questions. He sat very still and said nothing. which was somehow more condemning than the others because of its simplicity. A colony of people trying to live their lives under a restriction that had outlasted its own legal basis by 3.5 years. The documentation was clean and overwhelming, and there was nothing to argue against because the argument had never been about facts. It had been about whether anyone would bother to look. This time not about my archived reports but about the 11 days of silence and what I had observed, and what I had concluded. I told the tribunal everything I have told you here. I told them about my energy analysis, about Corvin's gravimetric data, about Carter and his saying, about Director Okafor and her cup of something hot, and the way she had said sorry. I told them that in my professional assessment, humanity had not wanted this confrontation. I told them that humanity had spent 30 years trying to resolve these matters through proper channels, and that the proper channels had been allowed to quietly fail them. I told them that the fleet above Earth was not a threat. It was the result of 30 years of patient people finally accepting that patience alone was not enough. The tribunal chair asked me if I had anything else to add. I said yes. I said that in 30 years of filing intelligence reports, I had never once filed a report that said something was fine when it was not. I said that I had filed reports warning about each of the 3 cases before this tribunal, and that those reports had been received, logged, and ignored, and that if anyone in the council's administration wanted to have a separate conversation about that, I was available. There was a notable silence after I said that. I thanked the tribunal and went back to my seat. The rulings came on day 9. The original vote was found to have been procedurally compromised. The sector was to be returned to human colonial jurisdiction. Reparations for 12 years of lost revenue were to be calculated and paid within 18 months. Convoy incident. The original closure of the case was found to have been premature and inadequate. The patrol commander's conduct was referred for a full military accountability review under Vorathi law, with council oversight. The families of the crew members who had not survived were to receive formal acknowledgement and compensation from the Varathi hegemony. Trade sanction. The sanction was immediately dissolved. Economic restoration assistance for the affected colony was to be provided by the Council Trade Bureau within 60 days. Additional findings. The tribunal issued a structural recommendation that the Council's grievance review process be overhauled, that a standing independent review body be established with actual enforcement authority, and that the disclosure requirements for Council members voting on matters where they held material interests be strengthened and actually enforced. Every ruling went against the Council's established positions. Not all of them went as far as humanity had originally demanded, but all of them were real. All of them had teeth. When the last ruling was read, I looked across the chamber at Director Okafor, who was seated with her team in the observer section. She was not celebrating. She was listening with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, the way someone looks when something has finally happened, that they did not completely allow themselves to believe would happen until the moment it did. I did not look at Dreveth. 3 days later, the human fleet began to descend. Not all at once. That was not their way. They came down in groups, slowly, over the course of 3 days, returning to their stations and their docks and the hidden berths beneath mountains and oceans and asteroid rock where they had been built over 40 years by people who understood that the galaxy did not always listen. The sky above Earth emptied the way it had filled, without drama, without announcement, with the particular quiet of something that has served its purpose and is no longer needed. Corvin sent me a message when the last reading dropped from his sensors. He said, "It is gone. All of it. Just Earth again." I read that and sat still for a moment. Then I opened a new report and wrote the last thing I would write about this entire matter. It was 3 sentences. I had thought about those sentences for several days, and I kept them because they were precise, and because they were true, and because I believed someone should put them in the official record where they could not be quietly set aside. I wrote, "Humanity did not come to conquer. They came to be heard. The galaxy should consider carefully what it will do the next time it refuses to listen." I sent the report to Cale Thevris, to the Tribunal Archive, and to the General Council record, where it would be indexed and available to every member species that requested access. Then I stood up from my desk, which I had barely left in 30 days, and I walked to the window of my office. Outside, Council Central was going about its ordinary business, which was the business of trying to hold a galaxy full of very different people together, under a set of agreements that were never going to be perfect, and were always going to require tending. I thought about Director Okafor saying she hoped they would not need those ships. I thought about Constance Webb sitting in front of the tribunal and speaking for 4 hours without trembling. I thought about billions of people choosing silence together for 11 days, not because they were told to, and they trusted each other enough to do it. I thought about Carter at that diplomatic reception, years ago, smiling and saying hope for peace while preparing for something else. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy for being chaotic, impulsive, emotional, and unpredictable. I had spent 30 years watching them, and I had always thought that reputation was based on watching them in the wrong moments. When humans are frightened, they can be loud. When they are grieving, they can be overwhelming. When they are joyful, they take up a great deal of space. But when humans are patient, when they have made a decision and committed to it, and are willing to wait as long as it takes, they become something else entirely. Something the galaxy had not understood until the morning a woman named Laura Okafor spoke calmly into a microphone while 500,000 ships waited above her planet in perfect silence. They become unstoppable. Not because of the ships, not because of the numbers or the fleet or the extraordinary scale of what they had built and hidden and waited to reveal, but because of the thing underneath all of it, the agreement, the trust, the billions of quiet voices that had chosen the same thing at the same time for the same reason, and held to it, and meant it. That was the thing no sensor could measure. That was the thing no military analysis could prepare for. That was the thing I had been trying to put into reports for 30 years, and could never quite capture in the language of intelligence assessments. I captured it now, in those 3 sentences, and I sent it where it could not be ignored. Then I went home for the first time in a month. The sky outside was very ordinary.